5 of the worst wartime betrayals. During war, who you can trust is one of the most essential and important things, whether it's on the battlefield or in the war room. Betrayal of this trust can have catastrophic consequences that ripple far beyond personal grievances, impacting the entire trajectory of war and human history. Across thousands of years, there have been times in war when people have made decisions that can only be seen as a deep betrayal of their comrades and country. The attack on Mers el-Kabir. It all started soon after Dunkirk. It's 1940, and the French army has suffered heavy losses. By June 7th, the Germans were less than 70 miles from Paris. The chances of the French negotiating with the Axis began to look more and more likely. The rest of the Allies, particularly the British, had a big problem with this. The French fleet was one of the world's largest navies and a strength against the Axis powers. What would happen if it fell straight into the Germans' waiting hands? Not only would the loss of such a fleet be a major blow, but handing it to the other side could spell disaster. In Britain, talks on how to proceed if France dropped out of the war had already begun. Admiral Darlan of the French fleet tried to assuage these concerns, responding he would never hand over the fleet, and orders to scuttle it would be given if there was no choice. In Britain, the War Cabinet met and agreed that they would only allow France to sign an armistice if it was moved to British ports before negotiations began. Unfortunately, this would leave French North Africa wide open to retaliation, and Premier Reynaud wasn't willing to risk it. The two countries continued to go back and forth. Reynaud resigned after another British proposal was rejected by his cabinet, and French Admiral Darlan was adamant Britain wouldn't survive the German advance and that he didn't, quote, create a fleet to offer it to the British. Nevertheless, word was sent to the British reiterating their promise to never let the fleet fall into German hands. Unfortunately, Churchill was disinclined to take them at their word, so Britain discussed another option. They sink the French fleet themselves. Meanwhile, Hitler recognized the French would never include the fleet in any armistice and instead offered that the ships would remain at Axis-controlled ports, firmly out of the war effort. The armistice was signed on June 22, 1940. It was then that Britain began discussing the reality of Operation Catapult. Appointing Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville, he was to sail to Mers el-Kabir, where a portion of the French fleet was kept, with 4 options for the admiral. 1. Bring ships back to British harbors and continue the fight. 2. Bring ships back to British harbors and allow them to be repatriated. 3. Sail to French ports in the West Indies and have the ships demilitarized. 4. Sink them. The admiral refused. With great regret and no small degree of awareness regarding the treachery they were displaying, British Vice Admiral Somerville gave the order to open fire on the French at 5:54 p.m., July 3rd. It became the first instance of the two countries firing on each other since the Battle of Waterloo. At the same time, 200-plus French warships and naval auxiliaries were seized in British home ports. 15 minutes later, Somerville gave the order to halt. He told the French he needed to see the ships sinking or he'd have no choice but to reopen fire. However, during this, a battleship managed to slip away, a tactical blunder by Somerville that led to follow-up attacks over the next 3 days. The result of this betrayal by the British was immediate. The French severed relations and responded by symbolically bombing Gibraltar. The British papers lauded the whole move as horrible but necessary, and Churchill gave a rousing but not entirely true speech to the House of Commons, claiming the Brits had succeeded in taking most of the French fleet and that a battlecruiser had aimed to put itself under German control. By July 6th, 1,297 French officers were missing or dead, and a further 351 were wounded. Somerville's letters to his wife showed his horror at leading the attack, calling it the biggest political blunder of modern times, and seething he had been chosen to do such a lousy job. The Battle of Hong Kong. It was 1941 and Britain sent a request to Canada to send 2 more battalions into Hong Kong to reinforce the city-state. It's quite possible at this time the man who suggested the move, Major General Grissat, didn't have the knowledge that those above him did, that despite Allied occupation, it was becoming inevitable that the Far East would soon enter into World War II. But another man almost certainly did, Chief of Canadian General Staff Harry Crerar. Despite high-level British contacts that should have warned him of the possibility, he assured the king there was no military risk. It was the start of a move that led to the betrayal of some of Canada's most vulnerable troops. Crerar was given a list of battalions by Brigadier J.K. Lawson, split into Class A, B, and C. He strongly recommended that Crerar not select battalions from Class C. These were troops that required refresher training or had insufficient training and were not recommended for any operations. To his credit, Crerar tried other options. 9 out of 10 of the Class A were earmarked for transfers overseas. In Class B, 4 were part of a newly formed division, and 3 were already employed on coastal defense duties. Seemingly, Crerar was left with little real choice in the matter. The volunteer groups, Winnipeg Grenadiers and Canadian Royal Rifles, were chosen from Class C to make up the newly established C Force. Crerar claimed his choice was based on wanting a division from each side of Canada geographically, and that they were on similar missions until recently, and so should be accustomed to the conditions. The reality was the recruits had no meaningful training, were inexperienced, and lacked the equipment required. In the words of one Royal Rifleman, "We were just kids." Nevertheless, the Japanese were coming. December 7th dawned, and the 6 battalions at the Hong Kong garrison were put to their battle stations after reports of movements on the border. Later that day, they were attacked. Brigadier Lawson, who had gone with the men to Hong Kong, rallied, but as per words by the Winnipeg Grenadiers troops themselves, it was just a matter of time before they overran us. With such little experience, they didn't stand a chance. Over the coming weeks, the troops were trampled and dismantled by the effective Japanese. Brigadier Lawson was killed in the attack, becoming the highest-ranking Canadian officer to die in World War II. Even the wounded weren't granted a reprieve, as the Japanese stormed into a hospital, bayoneting soldiers where they lay. The Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of C Force should have never even been there. It's widely acknowledged that they simply shouldn't have been put in that position. It was a betrayal of the men who trusted their country to look out for them to the best of their abilities. Instead, they were chosen to be put in harm's way, without the proper tools and resources to survive. In the end, 290 Canadians were killed, and another 493 were wounded. Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold is a name that has become synonymous with traitor in the United States. In one of the most dramatic betrayals in history, the high-ranking revolutionary officer Benedict Arnold turned coat on his fellow Americans, delivering vital information to the British. An extremely intelligent and strategic man, Benedict Arnold soon made a name for himself providing supplies and ammunition, and as a prominent leader at New Haven during the Revolutionary War. He worked his way up the ranks and became close confidants with Philip Schuyler and George Washington. Not long after, Arnold, along with Ethan Allen, seized Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain from the British. After his success, Arnold took a boat along the lake, retaking other positions until the whole of Champlain was firmly under American control. In 1775, he then led the failed siege of Quebec City, but clever tactical moves on his part still earned him greater awareness among the Americans. Promoted to brigadier, it was seemingly inevitable that Arnold would be one of the country's top generals soon. However, he had his enemies as well as supporters. Those who thought of his military plans as presumptuous were unimpressed when he took the lead away from Allen in fighting across the whole of Lake Champlain. As a result of those working against him, in 1777 Arnold found out that he had been passed over for the position of Major General, putting officers who worked under him as his superiors. Feeling betrayed, Arnold tried to resign, but his good friend George Washington refused to let him. Not long after, Arnold was severely wounded when a musket ball hit his leg and his horse fell on him. Against doctors' advice, Arnold refused to let his leg be removed, and he ended up permanently injured. Already bitter at the treatment from his fellow Americans, Arnold now lived a life off the battlefield, where he met many people he wouldn't have otherwise. It was here the seeds of his treachery were sown. As military governor of Philadelphia, he was engaged to Margaret Shippen, daughter of a loyalist. Whether Arnold was comfortable in his new life or just angry and reacted accordingly is a matter for debate, but he gained extensive debts from extravagantly living beyond his means and profiting from his newfound alliances. When accused by the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania of this, he wrote to Washington reminding him of everything he had done and how ungratefully he had been received in return. Although he was found guilty, Washington merely lightly reprimanded him, loyally standing by Arnold's side. Little did Washington know that Benedict Arnold had made new friends. Opening correspondence with one Major General John Andre of the British Army, Arnold set himself down an irreversible course of infamy, an inviting prospect, he believed, considering how his own countrymen had treated him. That's why when Washington offered him command of the Army's Northern Department, Arnold declined, citing his injuries as the reason, instead requesting control of West Point. In June 1780, Arnold sent plans of the Army post to the British and set about weakening its defenses, preventing repairs and dispatching troops to ensure it was ill-guarded. When Washington sent news of a planned secret visit, Arnold urged the British to come immediately to capture him. But on September 21, 1780, Andre was caught carrying papers that revealed their plans. Washington was said to be truly devastated, as he had trusted his friend and could hardly believe his betrayal. Arnold himself escaped, becoming a turncoat and brigadier general in the British Army, later wreaking havoc on Washington's home state of Virginia. Benedict Arnold's betrayal has gone down in history as one of the most significant moments of treachery displayed by an officer. But historians now ask, did America betray him first? Quisling, much like Benedict Arnold is synonymous with traitor in the US, there is a man from Norway who earned the same dubious honor, Vidkunquisling. Vidkunquisling was a Norwegian politician with strong pro-Nazi leanings, who created his own party, Nasjonalsamling, as an almost direct copy of Hitler's. In contrast to Norway's general acceptance of all people, Quisling was also strongly anti-Semitic, believing certain races to be inferior to those of Nordic descent. All in all, he was a very unpopular politician, which makes his rise to power even more surprising. As Hitler made his moves in Germany across the 1930s, Quisling, now Minister of Defense, was watching closely and admiring. We know during this period he was in contact with Hitler, or at the very least Hitler's superior officers, and in December 1939, Quisling and Hitler met in person for the first time. Seizing his opportunity, Quisling shared his ultimate goal, to unify the superior Germanic countries. Hitler invaded on April 9, 1940, after multiple meetings, including with Quisling, who shared information on military dispositions in Norway. Ultimately, though, it was the government's subsequent actions that left a vacuum for Quisling to make his own moves. Despite being forewarned of the invasion, the government response was lackluster. They rejected Germany's ultimatum and, along with the royal family, fled Oslo rather than stay to hold the administrative buildings. When doing so, they declared Oslo an open city, hoping it would save them from the catastrophic shelling that had been seen in Poland's capital, Warsaw. While this may have in some ways saved the city, it also left it very open for the Germans, who were able to easily take control of significant government buildings across Oslo, in collaboration with Quisling, of course. With no one to stop him, Quisling soon, with Hitler's support, appointed a new government under his leadership, announcing his decision to the Norwegian public later that day. Unfortunately for him, Hitler's man in Norway, German Reich Special Envoy Minister Brauer, was less than impressed with this. With the failure to capture Norway's king came the inability to persuade him to accept a pro-Nazi government headed by Quisling. Brauer was in the unfortunate position of trying to handle the difficult political situation that had arisen, and there was no love lost between himself and Quisling. The unpopular usurper continued to try to secure his government over the next few days, but due to Quisling's lack of support and his own suggested ministers rejecting the positions he had appointed, it didn't take long for his attempted coup to collapse. Hitler recognized it was important to keep Quisling on his side, but also recognized it was time to step in and sort the Norway situation out for himself. Instead, he appointed Joseph Terboven as head of Norway's government, but insisted Quisling should still have a reserve role that allowed him to be involved without actually giving him any power to make decisions. Quisling continued to blatantly work and support the Nazi side, to the disgust of the Norwegian people. Under Terboven's leadership, Quisling's NS party began to decline, and by 1942 Hitler was thoroughly uninterested in continuing correspondence with the failed politician, despite his continued heavy support and movements to support the Nazi party. After the war, Quisling got his comeuppance. For his betrayal of his country, he was sentenced to death. The Sack of Constantinople, 1204. The Sack of Constantinople, nearly a millennia ago, is still considered one of the greatest betrayals in history, the ramifications of which are still felt and discussed today. When newly appointed Pope Innocent III called for the Fourth Crusade, he did so with the goal of liberating the Holy Lands from the hands of Islam and absorbing them into the rightful empire. In reality, however, the crusade targeted the Orthodox Greek Christians of the Byzantine Empire in a treacherous move that betrayed their shared faith. Allegedly, Pope Innocent III had no idea of the Crusaders' real intent. The Orthodox and Western Christians had been clashing for over 2 centuries by the Sack of Constantinople. Their very different views of Christianity caused dissension and distrust between the two, with each viewing the other through checkered lenses. So, when the Fourth Crusade set sail in 1202, it was with advanced naval technology and an army of Venetians who had their own score to settle with those in Constantinople after earlier ejections from the city. Unfortunately, they soon found that only 1/3 of the anticipated number of Crusaders arrived, meaning they could not pay the Venetians for their fleet and provisions. In response, Crusade leader Doge Enrico Dandolo made a move that would cause him to unfavorably go down in history as one who put the wheels in motion for a Christian-on-Christian attack. Under his leadership, the Crusaders attacked Zara, a Christian city under control of Hungary. When he was sent word of what had happened, Pope Innocent III was furious. He announced the whole crusade was excommunicated and that the church did not support their treacherous actions. Although it was withdrawn from the French members soon after, for the Venetians, it remained in place. The situation only got more dicey when Prince Alexius Angelos then got involved. Potential heir to the Byzantine title, he persuaded the Crusaders to reinstate him in Constantinople, something some opposed and left a crusade in response to. In 1203, the Crusaders entered the city and procured Alexius his title. However, he failed to live up to his end of the bargain, and his popularity among his own people waned. After his assassination, the Crusaders, still camped outside the city walls, chose to attack Constantinople again. They captured the city on April 12, 1204, and set about desecrating the city, pillaging, slaughtering, and assaulting women as they went. By May 16, 1204, the first Latin emperor of Constantinople was instated, having successfully beaten down the Greek Orthodox Christians who had held the city. Rather than liberating a holy land, they had successfully created a new outpost of the Catholic Church. These actions are ultimately what led to the decline in Christianity in the East over the next millennia, leaving feelings of betrayal and ill feeling among different Christian denominations that still persist.